This is Becoming Antifragile with I.J. McCon. Each week I read a book and highlight the actionable wisdom within. To become anti-fragile, you must strengthen your mind and live with conviction. Let's get into it. Imagine that you're skiing down a slope and your full attention is focused on the movements of the body, the position of the skis, the air whistling past your face, and the snow-shrouded trees running by. There is no room in your awareness for conflicts or contradictions. You know that a distracting thought or emotion might get you buried face down in the snow. And who wants to get distracted? The run is so perfect that all you want is for this to last forever, to immerse yourself completely in the experience. If skiing does not mean much to you, substitute your favorite activity for this vignette. It could be singing in choir, programming a computer, dancing, playing bridge, reading a good book. Or if you love your job, as many people do, it could be when you are getting immersed in a complicated surgical operation or a close business deal. Or this complete immersion in the activity may occur in a social interaction, as when good friends talk with each other, or when a mother plays with her baby. What is common to such moments is that consciousness is full of experiences, and these experiences are in harmony with each other. Contrary to what happens all too often in everyday life, in moments such as these, what we feel, what we wish, what we think are in harmony. These exceptional moments are what I have called flow experiences. The metaphor of flow is one that many people have used to describe the sense of effortless action they feel in moments that stand out as the best in their lives. Athletes refer to it as being in the zone, religious mystics as being in ecstasy, artists and musicians as aesthetic rapture. Athletes, mystics, and artists do very different things when they reach flow. Yet, their description of the experience are remarkably similar. Flow tends to occur when a person faces a clear set of goals that require appropriate responses. It is easy to enter flow in games such as chess, tennis, or poker, because they have goals and rules for action that make it possible for the player to act without questioning what should be done and how. For the duration of the game, the player lives in a self-contained universe where everything is black and white. The same clarity of goals is present if you perform a religious ritual, play a musical piece, weave a rug, write a computer program, climb a mountain, or perform surgery. Activities that induce flow could be called flow activities because they make it more likely for the experience to occur. In contrast to normal life, flow activities allow a person to focus on goals that are clear and compatible. Flow tends to occur when a person's skills are fully involved in overcoming a challenge that is just about manageable. Optimal experiences usually involve a fine balance between one's ability to act and the available opportunities for action. If challenges are too high, one gets frustrated, then worried, and eventually anxious. If challenges are too low relative to one's skills, one gets relaxed and then bored. If both challenges and skills are perceived to be low, one gets to feel apathetic. But when high challenges are matched with high skills, then the deep involvement that sets flow apart from ordinary life is likely to occur. The climber will feel it when the mountain demands all his strength, the singer when the song demands the full range of her vocal ability, the weaver when the design of the tapestry is more complex than anything attempted before, and the surgeon when the operation involves new procedures or requires an unexpected variation. A typical day is full of anxiety and boredom. Flow experiences provide the flash of intense living against this dull background. This is an excerpt from Finding Flow by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. This book and his other book, Flow, was recommended to me by a friend, Mike. So thank you, Mike, for the recommendation. And I had seen this book multiple times throughout the last few years. And ultimately, I decided to get it and read it. And it is a fantastic book, because this particular book, Finding Flow, is Mihaly bringing together all his research in a way that is part psychological study and part self-help book. The goal for Mihaly in this book is to give you tools for how you can get into states of flow. And states of flow are very important in how you see life and how important life is to you. The more flow that you have, the more states of flow that you're engaged in, the more you perceive life as meaningful, life as purposeful. But the less flow that you have in your life, the less flow that you experience, you tend to be more pessimistic, you tend to be more depressed. What Csikszentmihalyi is trying to do here is to give you the tools and the techniques, and to also give you the theory behind why flow is important. So Csikszentmihalyi says, flow is a source of psychic energy in that it focuses attention and motivates action. When he says psychic energy, he's simply talking about the mental energy required for you to do the activity. And not just the mental energy, but it's the sort of where your whole being is called up to focus on that one particular thing that you're doing. And you see this most often in craftsmen, and we're going to talk about this throughout the podcast. And so for Mihaly, there's two concepts that we want to get down, right? One is psychic entropy and one is psychic nentropy. Psychic entropy is the state of inner disorder where it becomes difficult to get into states of flow, where your thoughts, your feelings, they're not in harmony with each other. You're constantly being distracted by something external to you. And this causes within you feelings of anxiety, fear, frustration, and it disrupts your ability to focus and pursue the goals, which ultimately leads you to not having states of flow. And psychic entropy, he says, it's the opposite of psychic entropy, where you're able to get into these harmonious flow of thought and action, where there's harmony between what you're wanting to do, the skill sets that you have, and the task at hand. And in Csikszentmihalyi's research, what he found was that the majority of people got into flow states either at work or through leisurely activities. And it makes sense because we spend a third of our time working. So he says, work is a strange experience. It provides some of the most intense and satisfying moments. It gives a sense of pride and identity. Yet it is something most of us are glad to avoid. And this is because even if the work that you do gives you satisfaction, sometimes it's not the case that it is the thing that you want to do. But you are able to get into states of flow that allow you to have moments of intense, satisfying moments when you accomplish a task, when you solve a complex problem at work. And if given a choice, oftentimes people want to avoid going to work or doing work because they rather be doing leisurely work. And something interesting that Mihaly says is that during the Industrial Revolution, there was very little time. So he says, workers assumed that if only they had more free time, they would automatically be happier. So unions were created, and the unions fought and won the case. Work became 8 hours a day versus 10, 12 hours. So Mihaly says, unfortunately, while free time might be a necessary condition for happiness, by itself, it is not sufficient to guarantee it. Nor does it seem that more of a good thing is necessarily better. As is true of so many other things, what enriches life in small quantities might impoverish it in larger doses. This is why by the mid-century, psychiatrists and sociologists were putting up warning signals to the effect that too much free time was threatening to become a social disaster. So we went from working too much, having very little time, and then thinking that if we had more time, we would be happier, to having a ton of leisurely time and not being any more happier than we were before, right? And that is the situation we're currently in. You work 8 hours, and it's possible that you spend a lot of mental energy or psychic energy, as Csikszentmihalyi says. And what ends up happening is, at the end of the day, you get home, and then you feel completely exhausted, right? Because Mihaly says it is very important that when you cannot find flow states at work, you have to find it in leisurely activities. So what ends up happening, however, is that when you get back home and you sit down, you become a couch potato. You go to passive leisurely activities, which have a negative impact on your life. And we're going to get into this later on. So Mihaly contrasts what work is like in the West, in the developed nations, with what work is like in tribal groups in Central Africa or in the Brazilian jungles. So he says, Among the least technologically developed societies, such as the tribesmen of the Brazilian jungles or the African deserts, grown men rarely spend more than 4 hours a day providing for their livelihood. The rest of the time they spend resting, chatting, singing, dancing. On the other hand, during the 100 years or so of industrialization in the West, before the unions were able to regulate working time, it was not unusual for workers to spend 12 or more hours a day in the factory. So the 8-hour workday, which is currently the norm, is about halfway between the two extremes. And he found that just because you were working less didn't mean that you were any happier. And this is something that we saw in the episode we did on Sebastian Junger's tribe, where the settlers in the early American colonies, people were escaping from the colonies, the settlements, and joining the American Indian tribes. And the reasons that they gave were precisely this. It was that you had more freedom to do what you wanted to do in these tribal societies than were you to stay in the colonies, right? The colonies were very rigid, sometimes very lonely. There was no sense of community. Whereas here in these tribes, in these American Indian tribes, they were doing very similar things, right? They would spend a few hours hunting if they needed the food, then bring the food back, share the food with the community, spend time chatting, singing, dancing, celebrating, and then do this over and over again. Whereas we are now, our situation at work is just an evolved version of what the Industrial Revolution has done for us. Instead of being on the factory line, we're in lines of cubicles. Instead of doing the same monotonous task on the factory line, we're doing the same monotonous task sitting at a desk, doing bureaucratic stuff. And this has a negative impact on people's mental health. However, there are situations where people love work. But Mihaly says, no matter how satisfying, work alone cannot make a life complete. Most creative individuals we interviewed said that their families were more important to them than their careers, even though their actual habits often belied these sentiments. And then he goes on to say, love and dedication to one's calling does not have to have the negative connotation of workaholism. The term could legitimately be applied to a person who is so immersed in work as to give up other goals and responsibilities. A workaholic runs the risk of seeing only the challenges related to his job and learning only the skills appropriate to it. He's unable to experience low in any other activity. Such a person misses a great deal of opportunities that contribute to the excellence of life and often ends life miserably when, after all-consuming addiction to work, he is left with nothing he can do. The point that Mihaly is getting here is that even though we spend the majority of our time at work, we have to be careful, one, that we don't get consumed by work and become a workaholic, which is a modern virtue in the West, right? There is pride in working as many hours as possible in a day without breaks. That is common. But the hard truth is that workaholism is different than the love of the craft. And this is something that comes up again. Because to me, a craftsman feels that he has a calling to his craft, right? He wants to hone his skills. He understands that his craft shapes his life to be meaningful. Whereas a workaholic, it's the opposite for him. So there's a quote from a book by Josh Hochschild, and he says, at the very least, the example of the craftsman suggests that there is a direct correlation between our care in manipulating a tool and the focus of our mind upon the complex task. You contrast this with the work that most people do, right, which is desk work, where the world treats people as objects to be manipulated by the corporation versus people being seen as craftsmen who take care in manipulating a tool to complete a complex task. And craftsmen tend to be people with very high levels of flow states, because for them, their psychic energy is embodied in solving this task at hand, whether that's a carpenter, whether that's an artist, or whether that's a blacksmith. So what Csikszentmihalyi wants us to understand is that there is a difference between being a workaholic and somebody who feels called to their work. These are two different things, because one ends up slowly spiraling into destruction, into psychic entropy, whereas the other one raises your level of consciousness to get into states of flow without disrupting your life, without removing your ability to experience the excellence of life. And that's what he's trying to get to. So he says, the quality of life does not depend on happiness alone, but also on what one does to be happy. If one fails to develop goals that give meaning to one's existence, if one does not use the mind to its fullest, then good feeling fulfills just a fraction of the potential we possess. And this is not new to us, because from all the previous books that we've studied, one thing that's clear is the idea of having a vision, a future goal where you are striving towards it. Mihaly here confirms the same thing. He says, look, just having good feelings alone, just because you feel good, doesn't mean that you've developed your mind to its fullest. When you feel good, it's only just a fraction. What we do every day matters, because what we do will end up dictating the quality of your life. And the quality of life it's not the best phrase here, but it's the idea that your life would be more meaningful if you do something that you are completely absorbed by, something that calls your soul into the craft, right? So Nassim Taleb has this quote in Skin in the Game. He says, artisans have soul in the game. Soul in the game is something that's greater than having skin in the game. Somebody with soul in the game does not do it for the money, does not do it for the fame. He does it for the love of the craft. And so for you and I, it's very important to think about what it is that we're doing every day and whether the things that we're doing are actually taking us down towards psychic entropy or psychic entropy. And as I was reading this, I made a note here because it reminded me of Arnold's words from Be Useful, the last episode, where he said, the only limits that truly exist are the limits that we place on ourselves. And so for Arnold, his message is for you to have a big vision, to dream big and to chase after that dream and to put all your work behind it. Remember the phrase, when schon, then schon, which is German for if you're going to do it with everything that you have. And interestingly enough, it's when you do activities with your whole being present, that is when you get into flow. And that's what Csikszentmihalyi goes on to discover in his research. And one other lesson from Arnold, which I think is very apt here, is do not limit yourself by conflating where you are currently, like what you're doing right now with where you can be. Because we don't want to fall trapped to the idea that where we are currently within our environment will determines what we can become. Because if that was the case, Arnold would not be who Arnold is. Because he came from a very small town in Austria. Nobody's ever heard of. Went on to become the greatest bodybuilder, highest paid movie actor in the world, and the governor of California. Don't limit yourself by where you are. That's the number one thing. And the other note that I made here is the happiness of your life is deeply connected to what you do. So make sure to do things that bring you joy, that allow you to get into states of deep flow. One activity that puts me into states of deep flow is painting. And I'd stopped painting for years, almost 15 years. And then recently, a few months ago, I picked it back up. And I forgot how mesmerizing the whole process is. There were times and days, I should say, where I was completely lost in the painting that I was doing, that I forgot to eat, that my wife would come in and say, hey, you got to eat. And then I would eat, and then I would go back to it. And then next thing I know, it's like supper time again. That's personally something that I've started to do again, painting. And you can see the painting that I did if you go to my Instagram. So make sure for you to do something that brings you states of flow. The other thing for me is training Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. Every time I train, I'm completely absorbed in the task at hand. Now, I would venture to say it's much easier to get into states of flow doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu because when you're doing it, it's similar to skiing, right? Where if your attention deviates slightly, when you're skiing, you might fall, you might hit a tree, you might tumble. Similarly, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if your attention deviates from what you're doing, you can likely get choked, strangled, your limbs broken. So it's very important to be fully focused, fully present in the task at hand. And that's why, not just for me, but tons of people, probably the majority of people who train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu will say the same thing, that they get into states of flow. And I think that's partially why that martial art is quite addictive. Once you get into it, it's very hard to stop training. So Csikszentmihalyi says, in order to experience flow, you have to have a clear goal. So he says, not because it is achieving the goals that is necessarily important, but because without a goal, it is difficult to concentrate and avoid distractions. The goals are what orients your mind. It's what places the constraints. And when the constraints are placed, it's much easier to avoid distractions because you know what you're supposed to do. But the times when you don't have a goal and you're simply just doing it for the sake of doing it with no purpose, that's when you get distracted, right? Think of the time when you're at work and you're sitting down on your computer and you have to do some work, but you don't really have any constraint. You're just there thinking, I got to do something. In those moments, it becomes much easier to get distracted right? Whether that's your coworker coming in, talking to you, whether that's your phone ringing, because there's no focus, because there is no clear goal that you've placed yourself in. But that's just a very specific example. If we expand that example out to your life broadly, right? Without a goal as to where you want to be, where you want to go, what it is that you want to do, everything that happens becomes a distraction, and you're unable to filter out what is noise and what are good signals. Csikszentmihalyi is making the point that you have to have some sort of goal. Again, this is very similar to the idea of having visions, which we've talked about in multiple episodes. Csikszentmihalyi says, the inertia of the past dictates that most of our goals will be shaped by genetics or cultural inheritance. It is these goals, the Buddhist tells us, that we must learn to curb. But this aim requires very strong motivation. Paradoxically, the goal of rejecting programmed goals might require the constant investment of all one's psychic energy. A yogi or a Buddhist monk needs every ounce of attention to keep programmed desires from erupting into consciousness, and thus have little psychic energy left free to do anything else. The note here I made is, don't let your circumstances dictate your goals, right? It's easy to blame your genes, your environments for where you are and what you could possibly do, but we're not going to be victims. What Mihaly is trying to get here is, do not be a victim of your past. Do not be a victim of your genetics. And for the Buddhists, and we did an episode on the Buddha, the goal for them is to not be attached to the things of your past. And in not being attached to the things of your past, you're able to transcend them and achieve states of nirvana. For you and I, it's not just nirvana, right? We want to get into states of flow in other things that we do, whether that's spending time with family, whether that's doing a leisurely activity, whether that's at work. It's very important to be able to turn on your focus so much so that you can get into states of flow. So in the excerpt that we read, right, he says, these exceptional moments are what I call flow experiences. The metaphor of flow is one that many people have used to describe the sense of effortless action that they feel in moments that stand out as the best in their lives. Athletes refer to it as being in a zone, religious mystics as being in ecstasy, artists and musicians as aesthetic rapture. Their descriptions of the experience are remarkably similar. The one unifying thing about all of them is not only that they're in states of flow, but all of these guys, all of these people are doing things that they feel they're called to do, or they feel like they're doing their life's purpose. And that is a key differentiator between people who are able to enter more states of flow and people who enter less states of flow. And that's because when you feel that something is your life's purpose, when you feel that your task, the work that you're doing, you are called to it, it becomes much easier to get absorbed into the work and to not be distracted by noise around you. That if you had a mystical experience, for example, you understand what the religious mystics are talking about, right? Because when that moment of bliss happens, it's as if you are in the present as much as possible. You're fully conscious of your surroundings, so much so that time almost stops. And that's because the more you are able to expand your conscious awareness, your physical awareness, that's when states of flow occur. So Csikszentmihalyi says, flow tends to occur when a person's skills are fully involved in overcoming a challenge that is just about manageable. Again, this applies to things outside of work. Like if you're meditating, if you're praying, when you're sitting still, your mind wants to wander. You want to scratch your back. You want to scratch your nose. You want to move around. You want to crack your neck. Just sitting there without moving itself is a huge task. But if you're able to transcend that, and if you're able to sit still as much as possible without being distracted, you are able to enter states of flow in your prayer, in your meditation. And I found this to be true. It is when I am distracted. It is when I allow myself to move around, to stretch my shoulders out. It breaks my concentration and becomes more difficult to enter into this state. But the times when I simply sit still, without moving, without getting distracted, without scratching my nose, that's when time dilation happens for me. It could feel like I've only been sitting there meditating or praying for 10 minutes when it turns out I've been there for an hour, 2 hours. So Mihaly says, the quality of experience as a function of the relationship between challenges and skills. Optimal experience or flow occurs when both variables are high. What he's trying to get here is when your challenge is high and your skills are high, that is when you get into states of flow. And using the meditation or praying example, the more you resist and look to overcome the distraction, and the more you're able to match that distraction by not getting distracted, by not falling prey to it, that is when the optimal flow occurs. So he says, almost any activity can produce flow provided the relevant elements are present. It is possible to improve the quality of life by making sure that clear goals, immediate feedback, skills balance to action opportunities, and the remaining conditions of flow are as much as possible a constant part of everyday life. So what we're looking for and how to get into these states is doing things that are high challenge, but also we're able to match that with our skill sets. Whether that's at work, whether those are leisurely activities. If those two are both high, that is when you're going to get into optimal states of flow. And when he says making sure you have clear goals and immediate feedback, the immediate feedback part is quite important, right? This is something that Anders Ericsson in his book Peak, which I highly recommend reading. It's one of the best books on skill acquisition and how to improve and how to learn as fast, in quotes, as possible. So Anders Ericsson talks about deliberate practice, and deliberate practice is getting into states of flow without actually him saying flow. He says you have to have goals and you have to have feedback. And it's in these loops that you're able to dramatically increase your skill acquisition. Whether that's playing the piano, any sort of musical instrument, or learning chess, or doing jiu-jitsu, or learning soccer, it doesn't matter what it is. He says if you can have clear goals and immediate feedback, your skill will improve dramatically because you, and this is me saying it, you essentially get into states of flow, and in states of flow, you're able to learn much faster. So when I read this book back in 2017, maybe 2018, I started implementing it in all areas of my life, whether that was doing jiu-jitsu, whether that was in my work, doing design, whether that was podcasting, whether that was studying, whether that was learning a new skill set. Everything that I did, I always had this in the back of my mind. And so reading Csikszentmihalyi's book and him talking about flow and talking about having clear goals and immediate feedback, that's where I was able to bridge and make that connection, because I wouldn't have said I was in states of flow when I was doing deliberate practice, but now, looking back, I was in states of flow doing deliberate practice. What then is the opposite of not being in flow state? And the opposite of not being in flow state is living a life that you hate, living a life where your outlook is completely depressing. And this is Csikszentmihalyi. He says, hell is simply the separation of the individual from the flow of life. It is clinging to the past, to the self, to the safety of inertia. There is a trance of this sense in the root of the word for the devil. It comes from the Greek diabolin, to separate or break asunder. What is diabolical is to weaken the emerging complexity by withdrawing one's psychic energy from it. Here what he's doing is he's contrasting a life of flow and a life without flow, and where these are two completely different lives. And he's encouraging us to live a life of flow and to avoid a life of hell where there is no flow. And he goes on to say, the quality of life depends on what we do in the 70 or so years we are allotted and on what passes in consciousness during that time. Your time here on earth is finite, and that is very obvious. And that's something we've talked about before, right? Our life here is a vapor. We're here 1 second and we're gone the next. And the life that you live, it consists of moments delicately stacked upon each other. Only this moment exists, not tomorrow, not yesterday, not what's going to happen in 10 minutes from now. Only this moment exists. And for you to be able to live in this present, not in the future, that is the biggest difference here, right? And when you're able to do that, you're able to get into these states. And when you realize this, when you realize that it is only the present that's here, and the present calls your whole being to focus on the task at hand, focus on the moment at hand, that's when you realize that you actually have nothing to fear. And not even death, because if your life is made up of moments stacked upon each other, that means if in every single moment you are here, present in that moment, then when death comes, there's nothing to fear because you've lived the life that you want to live, right? Your call is to live in this moment with your whole being, enjoying the beauty of nature, enjoying the creativity and the joy of doing creative work and the warmth of love. And so just as you don't try to pick up water, right? You don't try to hold on to the moment. Instead, you immerse yourself in the moment, like you immerse yourself in the bath. And it is through this that you achieve flow. And the more flow states you accumulate, the better your life will feel. And though feeling, as Csikszentmihalyi said, feeling alone is not enough to show you the full potential of your life, the feelings will correlate with how much flow you are able to attain here. And one of the most common places and times that we get into flow states or have extremely positive experience is around leisurely activities. And he breaks down leisurely activities into two categories. One is active and one is passive. And passive is the one that we want to avoid, and actives are the things that we want to do, right? But he says active leisure is another source of extremely positive experiences. When people do a hobby, get involved in exercise, play a musical instrument, or go out to a movie or restaurant, they tend to be more happy, motivated, concentrated, and more often in flow than in any other part of the day. So what this means for you is that when you're doing these active leisures, because they have a strong correlation to being happier, being more motivated, being more concentrated, the most important thing here is to not allow yourself to be distracted by passive leisure. What passive leisure means is essentially doom scrolling on your phone, watching TV, doing things that require very little focus on your end, but very high entertainment. Many things can fall into this category here. And so when you're doing active leisure, one of the concrete things to do here is when you're with friends or when you're with family, put away your phone. Don't look at your phone. You don't need to check your phone. And that is one of the most frustrating things for me when I hang out with friends and they're looking on their phone. What I'm always trying to do is trying to immerse myself in the conversation, in the moment with my friends or with my family. Because in those moments, those are when conversations start to get more lively, start to get more absorbing. And in those moments, that's when time dilation happens. And the sad truth is many of us spend an enormous amount of time on our phone every day, right? The average time spent on a phone is 5 hours a day. Just think about that. If you dedicated 5 hours of your day to reading, to studying, you could finish a book in 2 days, depending on how big or small the book is. And this just shows how addictive and how powerful these passive leisurely activities are. They also prevent you from getting into flow states. So one of the things that Mihaly brings up is the Roman Empire. During the decline of the Roman Empire, he says, by providing enough food to keep the body satisfied and enough spectacles to keep the minds entertained, the ruling classes were able to avoid social unrest. He goes on to give the example of how Attis, the king of Lydia in Asia Minor, introduced ball games as a way to distract his subjects when there was bad crops, when the season was bad, to prevent any sort of unrest by the hungry population. And he goes on to say, the record seems to suggest that a society begins to rely heavily on leisure and especially on passive leisure only when it has become incapable of offering meaningful, productive occupation to its member. So if you don't find purpose in your work, you will rely on leisurely activities, and specifically passive leisurely activities, because your mind is totally exhausted, not from focusing too much, because Mihaly says, look, the people who are in constant states of flow actually have more mental psychic energy to do other things. But people who are not in constant states of flow, whether in psychic entropy, they actually have less energy, and that's why they rely on passive energy to recuperate. And I thought this example that he provides was very interesting. He says, many indigenous people in North America have lost the opportunity to experience flow in work and communal life and seek to recapture it in leisure activities that mimic the earlier enjoyable lifestyle. Young Navajo men used to feel at their best when riding after their sheep over the mesa of the Southwest or when participating in week-long ceremonial singing and dancing. Now that such experiences are less relevant, they attempt to recapture flow by drinking alcohol and then racing down the desert highway in souped-up cars. And what he's trying to get here is that these indigenous people, they were, as we know from tribe, were able to get into states of flow that the Westerners couldn't. But as these indigenous tribes start to become more quote-unquote developed and start to adopt a more North American lifestyle, they're actually losing the opportunity to experience flow states in what they do and in their communal life. And as a result, they end up looking to other things like getting drunk and racing down desert highways, and just to experience these flow states. The point is, people are always looking for states of flow, even if they don't have a word for it, even if they don't have a term for it. So there's an example he gives of this businessman who ends up becoming a carpenter. And this guy says, I would have made a great deal of money in corporate life. I realized one day that I wasn't enjoying it. I wasn't having the kind of experiences that make life rewarding. I saw that my priorities were mixed up, spending most of my hours in the office. The years were slipping by. I enjoy being a carpenter. I live where it's quiet and beautiful, and I climb most every night. I figure that my own relaxation and availability will mean more to my family than material things I can no longer give them. And I made a note here about how important it is for you and I to understand that the most important things in our lives are not going to be getting into flow states to achieve material possessions, but getting into flow states where we can accumulate moments like spending time with our family, like enjoying the sunset. Like those moments are going to be the most important things for us as we age, as we get closer to our death. So he gives another example of this where people are losing their sense of flow, right? Through the work that they're doing. There's a disconnection. There's a divorce between what they do and how much it fills them. He mentions this research done by Antonelli della Fave and Fusta Massini of University of Milan, where they interviewed 46 members of an extended family in Pontentrex, a remote mountain village where people have cars and televisions now, but still work at traditional tasks, such as herding cattle, growing orchids, and woodworking. So they interviewed 3 generations. And what they found was that the first generation, the oldest generation, they experienced flow state doing these traditional tasks, like herding cattle, growing orchids, doing woodworking. The second generation, they found some flow states, but they also found flow states in leisurely activities. And the most interesting thing was the third generation, so the grandkids of the first generation, they found no or very little flow state in the work that they're doing, in these traditional tasks. And more often than not, they found flow states in leisurely activities. So Mihaly says, when the lifestyle of a social group becomes obsolete, when work turns into a boring routine and community responsibility loses their meaning, it is likely that leisure will become increasingly more important. And he goes on to say, if one's job is beyond redemption, the other solution is to make sure that free time at least will be a real opportunity for flow, for exploring the potential of the self and the environment. This is our modern situation, where the social groups have become obsolete. The community responsibility has lost its meaning because most of us are living in liberal countries. By liberal, I mean philosophically liberal countries. We're living in urban cities. We're living in cities where there is no sense of community, or at least not very strong sense of community. And because of that, your responsibility to the community is very, very minimal. And as a result of it, what ends up becoming more important for you is the things that you do outside of work. Because your work is just a boring routine to help you pay the bills, to help you buy the things that you want, to do the activities that you want to do that'll give you more higher states of flow. So it is important for us to understand this so that we can avoid living a life that we feel is meaningless. The last thing you want to do is spend 8 hours of your time doing something that you absolutely despise and are not achieving any states of flow, and then turning to leisurely activities just so that you can get the flow back. What we want to do in life is to harmonize and to unify all our interests, all our skills into one. And to do that, you have to understand what it is that is a psychic entropy to you. What is it that removes your sense of flow? What is it that adds and improves your quality of life? So one of the suggestions from Csikszentmihalyi, which I also recommend that you do, is, so he suggests that you keep a diary and you reflect on your day in the evenings, and you take stock systematically of the various tasks that you did and how it influenced your mood, how you felt doing it. And do this for a week, 2 weeks, a month. And what you'll end up finding is that you'll start to see high points in your day, low points in your day, and you're able to see, okay, this is what allowed me to get into these high states of flow. These are things that put me in low states. And once you have a stock of this, then you're able to reorganize your life. You're able to reevaluate your life in a much more comprehensive manner, because now you know what it is that you want to do, right? And you can start to orient your life towards this. And one of the things you might notice is that there are environments in which, whether that's physical environments like being on top of a mountain, going on a walk, or people that you surround yourself with, you might realize that certain environments help you tune into these states. Certain environments don't do this. And he says, it is very important to have friendships, to have strong companionships. Because if you have strong friends, they can actually help you in moments of distress, but also help you improve your life for the better. So Mihaly states, the strong effects of companionship on the quality of experience suggests that investing psychic energy in relationships is a good way to improve life. Even the passive, superficial conversations at a neighborhood bar can stave off depression. But for real growth, it is necessary to find people whose opinions are interesting and whose conversation is stimulating. A more difficult, but in the long run, even more useful skill to acquire is the ability to tolerate solitude and to even enjoy it. When I first read it, I was actually quite surprised by the sentence around how superficial conversations can help you stave off depression. But the more I thought about it, it made sense, because human beings are social animals. And so any sort of social interaction will help you stave off depression, because you're interacting, you're doing something that's natural to the evolution of human beings. One of the problems in the West is that we continue to expand access to comfort, right? Your sofa is getting more comfortable. Your computers are getting better. Your TVs are getting more higher quality. Everything around you is getting more comfortable, and it actually makes you want to stay at home longer, right? And not go out and interact with people. But at the same time, we have soaring levels of depression. And since 2020, the level of depression has gone up and skyrocketed. And part of the reason for this is, as our access to comfort grows, it also means that our ability to enjoy passive leisure also grows exponentially. It's easier for us to indulge in trivial pleasures that don't mean anything, that are actually bad for you, for your mental health, than to invest your psychic energy, to invest your mental energy into developing meaningful friendships, meaningful relationships. Part of the problem with all of this is that people don't want to be alone. Most of us are afraid of solitude. And because we're afraid of solitude, when you get home and say you live by yourself, the first thing you want to do is turn on your music, turn on your Spotify, turn on TV, just so that there is noise in the background, so there is some sort of distraction that's playing all the time, because you're afraid to be alone with your mind. You're afraid to battle the demons that are in your mind. And that's why, Mihaly says, a more difficult, but in the long run, even more useful skill to acquire is the ability to tolerate solitude and to even enjoy it. One of the things that we find when you study some of the most influential figures in human history, what you find is that the most influential figures in human history are not business people, but they're oftentimes religious, spiritual, or even philosophical. And it makes sense why they would be, right? Because the religious, the spiritual, the philosophical underpins what you do. Without a foundational base for what it is that you do, you don't have the motivation, you don't have the goal. But when you look at the lives of these figures, one of the things that stands out over and over again, and that comes up, is that every single one of these people, whether that's the Buddha, whether that's Jesus, whether that's Moses, whether that's Muhammad, they all embrace solitude. So when we did the episode on Buddha, what we found was that when he attained nirvana, it was in solitude, under the fig tree, when he had abandoned the previous practices that he was doing with the other yogis, and where he was starving himself, not drinking, not eating, and realized that he wasn't actually getting into these states that he wanted to get into. So then he said, let me try something else. Let me sit under this Bodhi tree, which is a fig tree. And it was in that moment when, if you remember, Mara, or translated into English is the evil one, appears to him and tries to distract him from this meditation that he's doing. In his solitude, in the silent, in the loneliness, it was his most challenging and yet the most rewarding thing that happened to him, because that is when he attained nirvana and became the Buddha. Then you look at somebody like Jesus. If you read any of the Gospels, one of the things that Jesus always does, right? He always sought out solitude before he did anything big. I'll give you an example. Jesus sought out solitude in the desert right before he goes and starts his ministry. In the desert, he's tempted by the devil 3 times, and he overcomes it. Then, before Jesus chooses his 12 disciples, he spends an entire night praying on top of a mountain by himself. Jesus will always withdraw to the mountain to be by himself to pray after healing people or preaching to large crowds. Then you look at Moses, you look at Elijah, you look at all these people. So with Moses specifically, Moses went to solitary places to commune with God. The burning bush, if you remember the story, it was one of those moments where it was just Moses and God said, the ground that you're standing on is holy, take off your shoes. So solitude is, in human history, one of the most important things that you should learn to embrace, because it is in solitude, it is in the silence that you're able to hear the wisdom. It's in the silence that you have the epiphanies. It is in the silence that you discover what is meaningful to you. It is in the silence that you can hear the voice of God. Csikszentmihalyi goes on to say, all of the evidence points to the fact that the average person is ill-equipped to be idle. Without goals and without others to interact with, most people begin to lose motivation and concentration. The mind begins to wander, and more often than not, it will focus on unresolvable problems that cause anxiety. People underestimate what their mind is capable of in two ways. One, they underestimate what it is that they can do with their mind, but they also overestimate what it is they can do with their mind. And one of the best ways to find out and to work on this is embracing solitude. Csikszentmihalyi says, other things being equal, a life filled with complex flow activities is more worth living than one spent consuming passive entertainment. And he has a quote from C. Van Woodward. And Woodward says, it interests me. It's a source of satisfaction, achieving something that one thinks is important. Without such a consciousness or motivation, it seems to me that life could be rather dull and purposeless. And I wouldn't want to attempt that kind of life. Of complete leisure, say of having absolutely nothing to do that one felt was worth doing. That strikes me as a rather desperate situation to be in. And Csikszentmihalyi adds, when we are able to confront life with such involvement, with enthusiasm, we can be said to have achieved an autotelic personality. So what is autotelic? Autotelic is composed of two Greek words, right? Auto, self, telos, goal. And autotelic is activity that we do for its own sake because to experience it is the main goal. Mihaly writes, if there is one quality that distinguishes autotelic individuals, it is that their psychic energy seems inexhaustible. Even though they have no greater attentional capacity than anyone else, they pay more attention to what happens around them. They notice more. They are willing to invest more attention in things for their own sake without expecting an immediate return. Most of us hoard attention carefully. We dole it out only for serious things, for things that matter. We only get interested in whatever will promote our welfare. The objects most worthy of our psychic energy are ourselves and the people and things that will give us some material or emotional advantage. The result is that we don't have much attention left over to participate in the world on its own terms, to be surprised, to learn new things, to empathize, to grow beyond the limits set by our own self-centeredness. Autotelic persons are less concerned with themselves and therefore have more free psychic energy to experience life with. And so what we want to do is we want to do activities for its own sake, not because it's going to give us some sort of material benefit. We want to do it for the sake of itself. And I think that's where, again, what's beautiful about craftsmen. They do it because the craft itself involves their whole being, and in them being consumed and being immersed in their craft and their art, they themselves change, they become better. What you have to look for is to find your calling, to find your purpose in the work that you do. When it becomes difficult to separate work from play, when your work starts to feel like play, where it ends up engaging your whole being, and you start to lose track of time because you're in states of flow, not because you're a workaholic, that is when you know you've found your purpose, according to Csikszentmihalyi. And the note that I made here on this is you have to flip the modern notion of work upside down. Work is not a means to an end, but an end in itself. Work is the active participation of the entire person in the act of creation. This focus is not only on material benefits, but on the act of creating something meaningful and lasting. From this arises satisfaction and fulfillment, because both our intellect and the body is engaged in the process of this work. There's a harmony between the intellect and the body, which is what allows us to get into these states of flow. And it is this harmony that is most evident in the satisfaction of farmers whose physically demanding work doesn't drain their souls but actively nourishes them. And there was a study done years ago. Different people were asked whether they were happy with their work or whether they were happy with their life. And what they found was farmers were the ones who were most satisfied with their life, who were most happy, And some of the most depressed people were people working in finance. And the study also asked, are you satisfied with the pay that you get, the amount of money that you get from your work? And the farmers were the ones who were least satisfied. They said that they were underpaid for the work that they were doing. They were the most happy. But the finance people said they were satisfied with the amount of money that they got, but they were the least happy. This is a lesson we can learn from watching some of the most successful, just outwardly most successful people in the world, whether those are people in Hollywood or whether those are athletes or whether they are authors. Just because somebody portrays an outward success doesn't mean that inwardly that they are happy, that they are satisfied. You want to find work, you want to do work that provides flow. So Mihaly says, the real challenge, however, is to reduce entropy in one's surrounding without increasing it in one's consciousness. The Buddhists have a good piece of advice as to how this can be done. Act always as if the future of the universe depended on what you did, while laughing at yourself for thinking that whatever you do makes any difference. It is this serious playfulness, this combination of concern and humility that makes it possible to be both engaged and carefree at the same time. With this attitude, one does not need to win to feel content. Helping to maintain order in the universe becomes its own reward, regardless of consequences. Then it is possible to find joy even when fighting a losing battle in a good cause. So I want to challenge you this week to get into states of flow by removing distraction. Right? Put your phone away or put it on Do Not Disturb, for example. That's what I'm doing right now as I'm recording this podcast. The second challenge is track where you're getting your flow states. Every 2-3 hours, write down what it is that you do, how that influenced how you felt or what sort of emotions that you had. And by the end of the week, right, so say from Sunday to the following Sunday, you'll have a good idea of where you're getting your flow states. And as we're in the beginning of this year, it'll allow you to think about how you want the rest of the year to look like. What are the things that you want to do? How can you increase your flow states? The third thing is, I want to challenge you to do active leisurely activities like walking, not doom scrolling on Instagram or TikTok or YouTube or binge watching TV shows, as much as that is something that you think will help you recuperate. Almost always passive leisurely activities, as Csikszentmihalyi talks about, doesn't energize you. It actually drains you more and more. And so allow yourself to get out of this idea that passive leisure activity is good for you. Do active leisurely activities. And that means, right, going for walks. One other thing I'll add to this is something that now I've been doing for a few years is I used to listen to radio all the time when I was driving. And I realized that when I listened to radio, I was allowing myself to be controlled in one sense, to subconsciously absorb ideas from people that I don't necessarily want to listen to. So I stopped listening to radio. So every time I'm driving, it's either I'm driving quietly with nothing on, or I'm putting on an audiobook that I want to listen to, or a podcast that I want to listen to. Radio is never in the picture anymore, ever. And the last thing is, when you are spending time with your friends or your family this week, I want to challenge you, immerse yourself in that activity. Whether it is talking to a friend, going out on a date, be fully present there. Don't check your phone. Don't get distracted by the people walking around here and there. Obviously, always be situationally aware, but immerse yourself in the activity that you're doing and be fully present in the moment, because our lives are moments delicately stacked up upon each other. And there is only this moment that exists. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this episode. If you've enjoyed this episode, share it with a friend. If you're not subscribed, subscribe. Drop a review. On Spotify, on an Apple, you can give a 5-star review. So until next week, peace.